Are you having a faith crisis? Are you trying to reconcile your understanding of scientific findings with your knowledge of Genesis? Did all of these Grand Canyon rock layers form in the 1 year of Noah's flood? Are the days of creation actual 24-hour days? Where was the Garden of Eden located? Did Methuselah really live to 969? Was Noah's flood global or local? Is evolution a belief or a fact? Were Adam and Eve real people? A Worldview Approach to Science and Scripture podcast series by geologist-apologist Carol Hill will help you find the answers to these questions and more. Science versus religion. What if there was never a conflict? Find out why, from a worldview approach, there is no conflict.
The purpose of this podcast series is to present solid science to the church, not to destroy faith, but to reconcile science with faith as a way to truth. This is not a young earth podcast, but is based on the sciences of archaeology, anthropology, geology, and astronomy. This is a new weekly podcast series, a worldview approach to science and scripture. Podcast series starts on Sunday, September 1st, 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 o'clock p.m. Central Mountain Time, and continues for 11 weeks total at the same time. Credits: narration by Daniel Hill. Royalty-free music composed by D. Brown and produced by 2U Films, Steve Pointer. Podcast number 3 is about the 6 days of creation. Are the 6 days of Genesis 24-hour days, long periods, or something else? This is Michelangelo's drawing of God creating the sun and the moon by fiat on the 4th day. There are 4 Christian views of Genesis 1. The first is 24-hour day. The second is the gap theory. The third is the day age. And the fourth is the literary. The 24-hour view. This view states that creation was instantaneous by fiat, and that the days of Genesis are 24-hour days, with each day marked by evening and morning. The 24-hour day position is held by most young earth creationists in conservative right-wing American churches, but it is held by very few scientists. The main difficulty with the 24-hour day view is that not only does it imply that creation took 6 literal days, but combined with the chronologies of Genesis, it implies that both the universe and planet Earth are only about 6,000 years old. And this interpretation is in direct conflict with all of modern science. According to the latest findings of astronomy, the universe is 13.82 billion years old, not 6,000 years old. This age comes from recent cosmic background microwave radiation maps and many other lines of astronomical evidence, such as from the new James Webb telescope that is mapping and determining the age of the earliest galaxies in the universe. The age of the Earth is known from many lines of evidence to be 4.56 billion years old. This is the European Space Agency Planck satellite's full sky map of the cosmic microwave radiation emitted only 380,000 years after the universe began. This all-sky image indicates that the universe is 13.82 billion years old and that it is composed of 68.5% dark energy, 26.6% cold dark matter, and only 4.9% atomic matter. Okay. The reaction of 24-hour day advocates to the scientific evidence for an old universe and Earth is either to deny the evidence or reinterpret it in light of their 6,000 years theology. This is no small matter, because in addition to the denial of astronomy and geology, it also denies the scientific evidence of anthropology, archaeology, and some of the fundamental principles of physics, chemistry, and genetics. The second view is called the gap theory view, and most of you probably have not heard of this view because it was popular in the 19th to earliest 20th century attempt to reconcile the 6 days of Genesis 1 with the then accumulating amount of scientific evidence for an old earth and universe. This view envisions an indeterminate gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Genesis 1:1 describing God's original universe, which could have been created billions of years ago. Genesis 1:2 describing some undefined catastrophic event, such as Satan's fall from heaven, and then the rest of Genesis 1 occurring as a recreation during a 6 literal day period about 6,000 years ago. This theory was immensely popular at the turn of the 20th century, so popular that the then prominent theologian J. Vernon McGee included it in his Scofield Reference Bible. The gap theory view is essentially a compromise between the 24-hour day and day-age view. The third is a day-age view. In the day-age view, the days of Genesis are not literal 24-hour days, but 6 sequential ages of unspecified, though finite, duration. It is also called the concordant view because the Genesis days are supposedly in agreement, or concord, with geologic time periods. The day-age view is the major position held by progressive creationists, and in defense of days being long period of time, its advocates argue that the Hebrew word yom can have more than one translation, either a 24-hour day or a long period of time, or it can even be taken metaphorically rather than literally as the day of the Lord. Like the 24-hour day and gap theory views, the day-age view has a number of weaknesses. It could be argued that this view was devised to accommodate modern science in its ideas of an old Earth universe. It could also be argued that it is supported by verses taken out of context. For example, let's take a day is like 1,000 years in Psalm 90 in context and fit it with the passages directly preceding it. So this is Psalm 91:4. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you were brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, you mortals." 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. These passages, taken together in context, put a different slant on things. The whole idea of Psalm 90 is that God is eternal and man is mortal. Time to God is meaningless. 1,000 years are but as yesterday, or a watch in the night, because he is from everlasting to everlasting. Seen in this contextual light, Psalm 90, 1-4 does not seem to support the days of Genesis 1 as being long time periods. Rather, 1,000 years is used as a hyperbole, emphasizing how much more infinite God is compared to finite humans. Non-concordance with either astronomy or geology. This contextual objection is not nearly as damaging to the day-age view as the fact that, when inspected closely, this view is not in good concordance with either astronomy or geology. The sun is presumably created on day 1, since that is when light is created and there is an evening morning. Yet on day 4, the sun is seemingly recreated. With regard to geology, it is illuminating to compare the Genesis 1 sequence of events with the actual geologic record to see how concordant the text really is. According to the paleontological record, seed-bearing fruit trees, that's in day 3, do not appear until the late Cretaceous period. That's about 80 million years ago. And long after fish, day 5 appeared in the Devonian period. That's about 400 million years ago. In addition, there was a reverse sequence in the appearance of birds and reptiles. Reptiles appeared about 340 million years ago, while birds appeared about 50 million years ago. When all the Genesis days are carefully scrutinized with respect to the fossil record, the concordance is superficial at best. Okay, here's a literary, also called framework view. Most people have not heard of the literary view, but rabbinic biblical scholars have proposed it since the 1st century AD. In the literary or framework, by that we mean 6 days of work, a 7th day of rest view, the days of Genesis are figurative 24-hour days, where the divine works of creation are narrated in topical order rather than in a strict sequential order. The narrative involves temporality. It starts in the beginning and works toward the creation of humans, but the narrative style is not constrained by the sequence of events. Importantly, the literary view maintains that Genesis 1 was written following the convention of literary works prevalent in the ancient Near East. If Genesis 1 is taken in the proper and intended context of literature written about 2500 to 2000 BC, there is no conflict at all with any of the controversial topics of Genesis 1. The Genesis authors were simply writing in the customary prose narrative style of that day. Thus, Genesis 1 was not meant to represent a sequential order of creation or one that needs to fit with modern science. It was simply the way that writers of that day wrote narrative text from their literary worldview. The fact that the literary view is topical is important when it comes to the supposed conflict between Genesis 1 and modern science. The problem of the fourth day disappears because the structure of the narrative is parallel, not sequential. The luminary sun, moon, stars in day 4 are specific to the general topic of light of day 1. Therefore, the Genesis author was not trying to imply that the sun was formed after plants. We just interpret the text this way from our Western linear cause and effect worldview. But this was not the biblical author's worldview. Their mindset was to impose a sacred symmetry on the text. Look at the next 2 columns in this table. Here, all of the supposed geologic objections disappear. Why are fish and whales grouped together? Because both fish and whales on day 5 are specific to the waters in day 2, and the fowl in day 5 to heaven in day 2. No time sequence is implied by these verses. The parallelism of days 3 and 6 is the same. Land creatures are specific to land. Such parallelism was the way the minds of the ancients worked. From their literary and worldview perspectives, they compartmentalized and organized material to be written into a narrative text based on 7 as the prime sacred number. Now I've got podcast 5 in the back here, because in podcast 5 we're going to be talking about sacred numbers versus numerical numbers versus numerological numbers. So we have to wait for that podcast to understand why the Mesopotamians considered numbers to be sacred. Worldview approach. What is the worldview approach to Genesis 1? A worldview approach favors the literary view over the other 3 views because it considers the literary conventions of the ancient biblical authors to be essential to correctly interpreting Genesis 1. It incorporates the ancients' use of figurative language, literary conventions, and the symmetry and harmony of numbers into the narrative text. For example, the words day, morning, and evening, taken figuratively, could apply either to a 24-hour period or to a longer period of time. Take your pick, because it didn't matter to the biblical authors. To them, the perfect, sacred period of time in which to develop a work was considered to be 7 days. This does not mean that the biblical authors made up the story of creation, only that the divinely revealed story was literally incorporated into the framework of conventional epic prose prevalent at that time. And since the language is figurative, then passages like Exodus 20 can be reconciled with Genesis 1. Metaphorically, we are to model our human work week after the figurative work week of Genesis 1, working 6 days and resting on the 7th. Important lessons to be learned from Genesis 1. What are the most important lessons to be learned from Genesis 1? Genesis 1 was not written to teach astronomy, geology, or biology. It was written to show the relationship of a specific Near Eastern people group to a creator God and their unique status in God's divine covenantal program with them. Too much emphasis on either a scientific or literal reading of Genesis takes away from this all-important truth. 2. God revealed his creation story to a people group surrounded by nations practicing animism and polytheism, religions based on mythology. The whole chapter of Genesis 1 has a strong thrust against such mythology. For example, God created the sun and moon. They are not to be worshipped. God is. Also, humans are made in the image of God, Genesis 1:26, and are therefore not to worship images of wood and stone, but the living God who is creator of heaven and earth. 3. Genesis needs to be interpreted from a Near Eastern 2500 to 1500 BC worldview, not from a 17th century AD European King James worldview or a 21st century AD scientific view. What's on for next week? The Garden of Eden. Where was the garden located? Was it a real place? This ends our podcast on a worldview approach to the days of Genesis. It is not the conventional way of interpreting the days as 24-hour days or long ages, but it is the traditional way that many Jewish scholars have interpreted the days for centuries. We will be going to the Garden of Eden next week, so be sure and be here. We'll